We have one final speaker coming up, so real quick, I just want to remind everyone, Ban the Scan, Facebook and Twitter. Definitely follow us if you're interested in more events, learning more about the cause. Give yourselves a round of applause for standing in the sun. I know how hot it is out here, so thank you guys so much for being here. Our last speaker, Michael Boldin, he comes to us all the way from Los Angeles, California, and he is the founder and executive director of the 10th Amendment Foundation. So give it up for Michael.
We don't need no stinking scanners. And we don't need no stinking permission to exercise our rights. We need to learn how to exercise our rights, whether they, the government, or the TSA, or any other agency wants to give us permission to or not. I think most of us here are probably in agreement that the TSA is out of control and just about everything it does is unconstitutional. And some of us here, including myself, would say that they shouldn't even exist at all. But the question that we have to answer is, what do we do about it? Do we march on Washington, D.C. in the hopes that the federal politicians will limit the power of this federal agency that they created and that they fund to the tune of $8 billion a year? Do we contact the TSA itself and demand that it put limits on itself, that it's going to fix its own problem that it created? Do we vote the bums out in the hopes that the new bums are going to say, well, you know, sorry for all those last guys. You know, they really screwed it up, but we're going to fix everything for you now? Or do we go to federal courts in the hopes that these 9 unelected, unaccountable, politically connected bureaucrats or lawyers on the Supreme Court are going to say, you guys have freedom to fly now, you have our permission? Or do we boycott the airlines till they're broke? Maybe, but maybe their buddies in Washington, D.C., like George Bush did back in 2001, will say, oh, these guys are too big to fail, and we'll bail them out with $15 to $20 billion of your money anyways. My message here, whether it's the TSA, the Patriot Act, or the endless foreign wars, is the same. Going to the federal government to fix problems created by the federal government isn't just a silly idea. It doesn't work, and it's never going to work. For decades and decades and decades, we the people have been marching and protesting and suing and demanding and voting bums out. But year in and year out, they violate our liberties more and more and more. They claim the power to listen to our phone calls, to read our emails, to monitor our library transactions, our bank accounts. They claim the power to bomb countries like Iraq and Pakistan and Afghanistan and now Yemen. And it doesn't matter what political party's in power. Both sides have advocated these types of policies for ages. So there has to be a different solution. We need a different way of doing things because we've been trying the same things, voting bums out, for a long time, and it's not working. So that's what I hope to share with you here. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were pretty smart dudes. Back in 1798, they gave us some advice on what to do in a situation like this, where all the branches of the federal government were conspiring against the Constitution and your liberty. That year, there was a law passed called the Alien and Sedition Acts. And part of it, and I don't want to get into all the boring details of it, but part of it was criminalizing free speech. Right after the founding of the country, they already passed a new law that was saying, hey, if you criticize your own government, you could go to jail, and people were getting arrested. Well, Jefferson and Madison weren't going to say, let's just sit around and let them do this. Let's wait till it just fixes itself. And in response, they wrote what was known as the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions. They weren't very popular with the politicians in power at the time, but they were very popular with the grassroots. They were known as the Principles of 98. And they give us a really good blueprint on what we can do right now to resist things like the TSA or the Patriot Act or the Military Commissions Act or all these different things that the federal government has been slamming down our throats for so many years. And I'll give you a couple of little choice quotes. For example, Thomas Jefferson in the Kentucky Resolutions wrote, "The several states composing the United States of America are not united on a principle of unlimited submission to their general government." And what he meant was, just because the government passes some law or makes some rule or some agency, we don't have to sit and quietly submit to it. And he went on, and he said, whensoever that general government assumes undelegated powers, this was Thomas Jefferson, author of Declaration of Independence, he said, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. And what he meant by that was that we're not supposed to sit around and wait for the federal government to fix its own problems. We're supposed to resist violations of our rights in our communities, in our families, in our states, as they happen. James Madison had a very similar vision that same year in 1798. And he wrote, in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, that the states are duty-bound to interpose, to stop dangerous, unconstitutional acts from the federal government. It's the state's duty. The father of the Constitution said, when the federal government violates your rights, it's the duty of your local governments to stand up, step in, stand between you and the federal government to try to stop it. And that's what we're talking about here today. For example, many of you are hopefully signing this petition to get a bill introduced in New York City to ban the scanners. Or down in Texas, they had House Bill 1937, which maybe you've heard about. But this was a bill that would ban the grope downs, which I had my first one last night at Los Angeles International. I'll tell you, I've seen the videos of people like Susie Castillo being very upset at these things. And I thought, okay, yeah, they shouldn't be doing this. But it can't be that rough. But I'll tell you, 4 times this guy was railing up in my crotch. And afterwards they were done, he walked over to one of his coworkers and they looked at me and they pointed and he told the story and they sat there laughing at me. It sucks. It sucks, I'll tell you that. So I quietly submitted it so I could get here with you today. But the message that Jefferson and Madison gave us is that we're not supposed to wait 2 or 4 years for some federal politicians to fix things for us, because they don't. We're not supposed to wait 2 or 4 or 6 years for some judges to tell us that we have permission to be free. We're supposed to take action in our community, in our states, in our towns, right now. Not next year, not next fall, not next month or next week. Today. Not tomorrow. Now. So, for example, when the feds threatened the state of Texas with a no-fly zone, did everyone hear about this? Texas was trying to pass this bill, and the Department of Justice came in and said, well, maybe we'll shut down all air travel. It's not just Libya that's getting a no-fly zone. It's Texas. Well, in the Jeffersonian and Madisonian spirit, I think Texas should have sent a letter in response, or maybe an email. And I wrote it up here. Dear federal government, thank you for your note and your opinion. Go to hell. The federal government threatening people to not fly is not new. A lot of people were freaked out about the Texas thing, but this has happened before. Back in 2005, the Bush administration gave us the Real ID Act. This was a privacy-violating national ID card that was not constitutional. And they said if you didn't get these new ID cards, sooner or later, you wouldn't be able to do all kinds of stuff. For example, get on a plane.
Mark of the beast.
Well, starting in 2007, the ACLU and a number of states started passing laws and non-binding resolutions denouncing the Real ID Act and also refusing to comply. For example, Maine, New Hampshire, Montana, all specifically said, we're not going to comply with this. You may have your law in DC, but it's not going to be valid law here in our state. For example, Montana specifically and unanimously passed a bill that said the Real ID Act is null and void in our state and it has no effect. So by the time that this started catching on, there was maybe a dozen or so states that were doing this. The Bush administration started freaking out. They had a little rebellion on their hands. So what did they do? They started issuing threats. Montana was one that was really getting a lot of pressure. They were saying, you know, if you guys don't come into compliance, you guys don't, and they actually did it right to the people, not to the state legislature. If you don't convince your state government to get on board and commit to this fully, you're not going to be able to do stuff like travel and get on planes. Starting in May of 2008, you will not be able to fly anymore. And so in an interview on NPR, Governor Schweitzer, a Democrat, was asked about this. Hey, Governor Schweitzer, what do you think about this threat to your citizens of your state? And I've got another nice little quote. He said, this is pretty good. We found that it's best to tell them to go to hell. And we'll run the state the way we want to run our state. And he also said, well, thanks for playing, federal government. Montana's not in anymore. So what happened when Montana and a dozen other states said, no, we will not comply with your federal law or mandate? Did they shut down air travel? Did they take away highway funding? And I didn't see any tanks rolling into Montana to shut down the Real ID resistance either. They huffed and they puffed, but when it came down to the deadline, they quietly backed down because they realized that a dozen or more states resisting their unconstitutional acts would be a PR nightmare. And in the last 4 years, more than 24 states, I believe it's 25 now, have passed laws or resolutions rejecting the Real ID Act. And the federal government has had to back down not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. There's no jackbooted thugs going to Missouri to tell people, you know what, get your new ID card, you're not going to get on a plane. The message is, when enough states and enough people say no to Washington, D.C., there's not much that they can do to force their mandates, their plans down our throats. And in regards to the TSA, there's already 5 states that are considering bills to either ban whatever they call these pat-down things, these violations of the Fourth Amendment, or to ban scanners. And sources close to my organization, the 10th Amendment Center, tell us that we should expect at least 10 other states doing the same thing in 2012. Days after Texas backed down to the Department of Justice, Carl Wimmer, a legislator in Utah, already announced that he was pre-filing a bill to do the same thing that Texas was doing in Utah. So there's the first one. And we do expect to see a number of others. We've been in contact with a number of other legislators around the country. And we hope that maybe Mr. Greenfield here in New York City will have the courage to follow through on what he talked about last fall and just get the bill introduced and let the representatives of the people make a decision about what they want to do about the TSA. So we have 25 states that have effectively nullified in most of the country the Real ID Act. My home state of California, since 1996, has been defying the drug war. You know, we smoke weed in California. A lot of people would like you to go to jail for doing such a crazy thing. But there's now 15 states that are pushing back on the unconstitutional drug war. And interestingly enough, on the marijuana issue, when that bill was being introduced, or that proposition was Prop 215 was being introduced in California, 3 separate presidents came to California and campaigned against it. And they said, oh, supremacy clause, you can't just pick and choose what laws you want to follow. if you guys pass this thing, the DEA is going to come and bust all of you guys. Well, bring it on. We did it anyways. A lot of them do smoke weed themselves. And soon enough, other states, Montana and Hawaii and other states, I don't know why New York hasn't gotten on board on this thing yet. Cuomo loves prohibition? It's disgusting. I mean, I think of the amount of people, the hundreds of thousands of people, not to get in, I mean, I like talking about this topic, but the hundreds of thousands of people that have been arrested for growing or owning or consuming a plant, I think history is not going to look too kindly on this country for that. It has decimated minority populations in this country. The amount of money that it's cost, the wars that have been waged over it needs to be ended. I'm sorry to be distracted. It's a very passionate issue for me. But the interesting thing about the weed issue is that this actually went all the way to the Supreme Court. There was a lady in Northern California named Angel Rate. She had like a baseball-sized tumor in her head. And under California law, her doctor said, oh, you know what would be good for this is weed, smoke it. So she had 6 cannabis plants in her backyard. She never bought or sold them. She just consumed them to relieve her pain. And the DEA came in and they tore up her house. So it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And guess what? The Supreme Court said, too bad, people. It's illegal anyways. We don't care about your stinking state law that allows medical marijuana. There's actually a lesson in this. At the time that the Supreme Court ruled in 2005, that in essence state marijuana laws were illegal, there were 10 states that had very similar laws on the books. So how many do you think repealed them after the Supreme Court said you can't do that? 0. And since then, another 5 states, most recently Arizona, not a liberal hotbed by any stretch of the imagination, they passed a medical marijuana law. And the lesson is the same. When you have enough states and enough people saying no and resisting an act by the federal government, they can't stop you even if the Supreme Court says you can't do it. So that's what I believe our blueprint is. Whether it's the TSA, and I talk about the Patriot Act a lot, the war on drugs, and all these different things. Our blueprint is 3 simple steps. Well, they're not really simple. It's actually very difficult, and it's going to take a lot of us more backbone than I had at the airport last night. Step 1, we have to resolve that we're not going to be brutalized anymore, that our rights are not going to be violated, and we're not going to tolerate this law or this act or this agency taking advantage of us anymore. 2, we have to leverage locally. Washington, D.C. is not going to save you. Barack Obama is not going to be the peace candidate. And neither is Mitt Romney.
Ron Paul, baby!
Danny Panzella. The federal government will not save us. Even if Ron Paul were elected and stopped it, that doesn't fix the problem forever because the next guy still has the power. We have to learn how to deal with these issues locally, no matter who's in power. So we have to leverage our local community and reach out to people that we disagree with to form single-issue coalitions. I'll work with anyone. I'll work with a Republican. I'll work with a Green. I'll work with an anarchist, a communist, a Democrat, anybody. If we can agree on a particular thing and it advances a cause for us, it's important. And I think violating the 4th Amendment is pretty darn important. And 3, I won't go too far with this. The 3rd is we have to network nationally. We have to reach out to other communities and other states and encourage them to do the same. So when Texas gets threatened with a no-fly zone, they're not alone. The Real ID Act, the resistance to the war on drugs. When it's one state, it's a lot easier for them to crumble, to fall down, to be afraid. Politicians don't generally have a lot of backbone. So it takes a lot of people doing the same thing in various communities. In a city like New York, if there was just a bill being considered here that would say we're not going to allow scanners at JFK and LaGuardia, this would send shockwaves around the entire country. It ain't gonna happen in California. So I plead with you, or I beg of you, to do everything that you can to get Mr. Greenfield or Mr. Halloran or anybody else in the assembly here to at least, like I said, introduce the bill and allow the people to decide. But we're taking notice. And if you keep doing that, we're gonna start resisting too. The idea, what he was trying to say, and he said it in his signature with a Latin phrase, Concordia res parve crescunt. It's our slogan at the 10th Amendment Center. It means small things grow great by concord. And the penman of the revolution was right. Small things did grow great, and America broke free from the tyranny of the king. And today, small things can grow great. Every small act, every small step that you take, every small rally, every big rally that we go to, standing up for our rights, it opens more eyes to our message. It opens more eyes, and it creates more courage to action. And that is how we grow this movement and actually win. So I believe that no matter how difficult the odds, and I don't think resisting no matter how insurmountable things may seem, it's essential for us to always do what's right. And for us, standing up for the Fourth Amendment, every issue, every time, no exceptions, and no excuses, is the way we need to start doing it. Over the last couple of years, I've gone through a lot of mainstream media interviews. And it's pretty funny that no matter whether it's Fox News or CNN or the New York Times or Bloomberg or any of these guys, they always ask the same thing. Hey, so what political party are you guys into at the 10th Amendment Center? And I give them a stock response. The 10th Amendment Center is a nonpartisan think tank that stands for the Constitution, every issue, every time, blah, blah, blah. And they always respond with the same question as a follow-up. They say, oh, well, what about you, Michael? You're the founder of the organization. What political party do you support? You know, so we understand what direction you're pushing it. Political party? None. I don't think they believe me, but it's true. I'm not a Democrat or a Republican or a conservative or a liberal or an anarchist or a green or a socialist or a libertarian or anything in between. I'm not even an independent. All I am is me, and all I want is to live free. Thank you for joining me.